Okay, well, what I'm going to talk about tonight is the basics, very basics, because of course there's way more to it than I could possibly ever hope to go into. But the very basics of rendering with the Cycles renderer in Blender. And I've got a really simple little animation here. If I scrub through the timeline, you can kind of see I've got a camera that's animated along a path. I've got a demo about that too if you've always wondered how to do that. And I've got it pointed to an empty object, and excuse me, and then the empty object is animated, and then the camera is sweeping along the path. And if I go here to the camera view, you can really kind of see exactly what it's looking like. Okay, or I should say looking at. And this is all in Cycles renderer. So if I go back to my Cycles texturing thing that I created myself, you can kind of see exactly where we're at as far as just a simple texture, and then it's moving around. There we go. Okay, so we've got a simple sphere, a kind of wooden plank here, and some sort of a I don't know, very bumpy floor carpet thing. I just put that on there to put some texture in there. So anyway, very simple textures, especially with the Cycles renderer. It's very simple and very easy to do. But now what we're going to do is we're going to go over some of the very basic options that you have for rendering with your computer to kind of make a movie. This is really short. It's going to be about 150 frames long or so. Actually, I'm jumping a little ahead of myself. So anyway, before we go any further, let's just start at the top. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to, I don't know where you might be. You might be on the constraints or whatever. You're going to go over to your, assuming that everything is all ready and your lighting is all done and everything like that. You're going to click on the camera, and this is the first scene that you've got. This is the only scene that I've got. And first thing you do is you have three choices here. You can render, you can do an animation, or you can do the audio. And we're really only going to deal with the first two, but basically it just is telling you what you're going to render. The first one, it says render. I wish it didn't say render. I wish it said still, because essentially what it is it's a still frame. So if I click that, you'll see that it's going to power through a quick render right there, right then and there, and it does a single frame. And it tells you what frame it is, how long it took you to do that frame, and some memory, how much memory the whole thing was taking. Now, first thing that a lot of people do when they get to this is like, what do I do? I can't get back. Like, where did my stuff go? Well, all you have to do is click down here, and you have to go back to the 3D view. And what you did is when you rendered that, you opened it, or it opened you up in the image editor. So one of the things that I like to change right off the bat is I take the display from the image editor and put it into a new window. And this will open up, so whenever I hit render, this is going to fire off a new render, and it's going to go straight into a new window. And if I want to cancel or anything, I just need to close the window, and I don't lose whatever I'm doing down here in my user view. Okay, so that's really kind of nice. The next thing is the feature set. 99% of the time you're going to want to be under the supported feature set. There are experimental features. I can't even list any of them because some experimental features end up becoming supported as the versions move on. And so you can look that up by your version of Blender. For this demo I'm using 2.78C, which is actually a version or two old already, but that's what I'm on right now because I've got some projects and stuff that I want to stick with that version. So I pretty much I stick with supported. You can play with experimental, but as soon as you do that, Blender may crash, you may lose data, whatever. So I guess that's up to you. You can play with that, and again, just do some research, find out what some of those things are, those features that are experimental, and maybe you want to do that. It's really up to you. Next is the device that you're actually going to be computing the render with. Now, a lot of this depends upon your computer. and it depends on what kind of a device you've got, what kind of settings you got. If you're doing cycles renderer, you theoretically should have gone to the user preferences over under system, and you should have set this up so that it's set to CUDA. Okay. Hopefully you did that. You can still render with the CPU, or you can render with the GPU. And what I like to do is I'll just do a simple test. So I'm going to take my, I'm going to keep it on CPU, and I'm going to render a single frame right here. And I like to do a frame that's got reflections, or, you know, something that's kind of difficult so that I can, you know, really get a sense of it. Okay, so that took 6 seconds, or 6 seconds, 6.25 seconds. Okay. So then what I'll do is I'll take my GPU, and I'm going to set that up to GPU, and I'll hit render again and see what it does. Now, there may be other reasons to stick with your GPU over your CPU. So here it took 8.15 seconds. So theoretically you might say, well, hey, that's longer. You want to use your CPU instead of your GPU. And you may be correct. But there's other things that you might want to take into account. So for instance, are you using a Quadro graphics card? If you're using a Quadro graphics card, then the render times may actually be a little longer than a nice CPU. I've got a 6-core 12-thread 5760K overclocked to like 4.5 gigahertz, and it's water cooled and all that other good stuff. So the CPU is pretty darn fast. But if I had a Quadro graphics card, let's say, that's got error correction. That's mission critical stuff. And so you might want to sacrifice some time for a Quadro graphics card that's going to make a better image in the end. So that, you know, can help a lot. And so, you know, typically I'll stick with the GPU. There's other things that we can kind of work with down in the settings that can help the GPU actually go faster. And we'll get to those in a second. So next is your resolution. You know, again, this is kind of project dependent. The defaults are set to 1080p, but one of the things that some people miss is they miss that it's set to 50%. So essentially it's actually rendering out a 720p instead of a 1080p. So we're going to bump that all the way up to 100. That's going to increase our time per frame, of course, because now we're rendering out a much higher image. Now we want to set our frame range. So for this animation, my frame range is going to be from 1 to 150. So I don't need all that extra time. That's just wasted time. That's empty frames that it's going to have to render that aren't changing much. So I'm going to take that down to 150. You could render every other frame if you wanted to, or every 3 frames or 4 frames or whatever. I don't know why you'd want to do that, but you can do that. It's pretty cool. Aspect ratio. Aspect ratio for most high def stuff is not important. However, if you are rendering for standard definition TV, widescreen, like old school 16:9 widescreen where the pixels were actually rectangular instead of square, you might need to work with that. But again, 99% of the time, you want to leave that at 1:1, maybe even more than 99% of the time, 99.9% of the time. So that's just one of those things that you probably will not have to touch. But that's what it's for. If you wanted to do something where the pixels were rectangular for anamorphic or things like that, that could be an issue. Now, frame rate. So right here we've got 24 frames per second. That's pretty much the standard for film. If you're doing video, you might be at 29.97. If you're even going to like some of the 60 frames per second cable, HDTV standards, you might be at 59.94 or 60. If you're doing stuff for film, most of the time you're going to be at 24 frames per second. But that's, again, you kind of need to know what your workflow is, what your if you're integrating your animation into other files or into video or that sort of stuff, you should do your research and find out what your frame rate is, because you don't want to render this out at a wrong frame rate. However, let me say this. You should know what your frame rate is before you actually start animating, because the timeline here is done in frames. Okay, so if I've set this up for 30 frames per second and judged my time and said, you know, I want this to be about 3 seconds long, so it's 90 frames and all that sort of stuff. When I render it out at 24 frames per second, it's actually going to be a bit slower. The motions will be a little bit almost like a touch of slow-mo. So this isn't really something to be messing around with after you've done all your animations. This is definitely something you want to set beforehand. Yeah, I don't know. And then you can do a time remap if you need to slow things down or speed things up, which is kind of cool. Metadata, I don't typically play with this too much. Time, date, render time, frames, scenes. You can add other stuff to it, sequence, strip, notes, whatever. You know, usually I don't. I just make sure I name my files correctly. But for bigger projects, that could be really important. So kind of, you know, keep your eye on that. Now we come to some really important stuff. Output. The default in Blender is output to a temporary file. This temporary file is set in the same directory as your Blender file, and it can disappear. In fact, it oftentimes does. So one of the things that I'm going to do right away is I always make a new folder for this. So I'm right on my desktop, which, you know, probably isn't the best thing, but I'll keep it there. I have a bunch of hard drives I would probably rather use, but that's okay. And I'm going to make a folder called Blender Render. And I'll open that up, and I'll accept that folder. And now you can see right here the output is going to be going to the folder. Now, overwrite is set on. And what this means is as you're rendering new files, if there's an old one that has the same name, it's going to write over top. You may want to check that off so that you continue to keep old renders, especially if you're trying to experiment with something, figure something out, or just trying to see how things go. You probably don't want to delete older ones. So I almost always turn that off. Again, that's your, you know, whatever you want to do. So now, here comes the big stuff. The format. How are you going to be saving this? Now, most of the time, a lot of people like to save them out as PNGs or TIFFs. PNGs and TIFFs are still images, so each frame in your animation will be a simple still photograph. And then what you can do is you can load them into a video editor as an image sequence. Each frame or each still image will be 1 frame long, and then you can make a clip out of them. And that's usually the best quality. If you want to just make a movie, which is what a lot of people do, then you want to take this off, because, you know, right here I've got a short animation that's 150 frames. If I hit render right now, and then I go look in my Blender render folder, all this is 150 pictures. And if I wasn't expecting that, or I didn't want to go through the process of doing an edit with video editing software, that could be a little surprising. So what I really want to do, at least for me right now, is I'm going to set it to a movie file. You got a whole bunch of options, and I recommend that you kind of investigate those. AVI RAW is excellent. I like H.264 if I'm going to YouTube, which is most of the time what I'm doing. Most of my viewing is compressed, and it's not the best quality, but, you know, so H.264 is kind of the standard, and it's really good. So what I'm going to do is H.264, and then over here I can choose black and white or red, green, blue, which is kind of fun. And so I'll hit RGB. And now I'm going to open up the encoding. So I've got the encoding, and here's my format, and there's my codec. And the format is simply kind of the container for the video. AVI is good. I personally prefer MPEG-4s or just H.264. But usually I'll put an H.264 in an MPEG-4 container. And that seems to work really well for me, especially for going to YouTube or that sort of thing. So now we want to talk about the quality. Your bitrate. Well, bitrate is going to determine the file size as well as the quality. If you're uploading to YouTube, I generally like to upload files that are 12 to 18,000. That seems to be pretty good quality for YouTube. You know, that's not close to, say, Blu-ray disc quality or whatever. One of the things that I would highly recommend is doing a little bit of research and finding out what the bitrate is for the target that you're trying to reach. If you're going to Blu-ray, you know, DVD on Blu-ray, then that would be one thing. If you're just going to Vimeo, then that might be another thing. If you're going to YouTube, then it probably would be a completely different thing. So that's something, again, that's very highly individual. For now, I'm just going to take and I'll put this at 14,000. Now here we have our bitrate minimum maximum. If your rate minimum is set to, or if your maximum is set to less than your target bit rate, well, that's kind of silly, right? So usually what I'll do is I'll do my average bit rate about 14,000. I'll take my maximum to about 18,000, and that gives me a really pretty high quality. And then I'll take my minimum, and sometimes I'll set it to about 10,000 or 12,000. And that usually seems to be pretty good. For those of you who use Adobe Premiere, I think 12,000 is kind of the standard for H.264 output when you're going to YouTube or something like that. And I usually like to bump it up a little higher than that. Right now we don't have any audio, but you could set that to an MP3 or AAC or FLAC, which is lossless. And then if it's like an MP3, you can set the bitrate. For good quality, I would always recommend about 320. And you can play with volume. We don't have any audio in this, so that really doesn't matter. Alright, now we're going to go to sampling. I'm going to skip over some of these things like freestyle and stuff because they don't really matter much for most people. Honestly, some of them I don't even know what they do. Okay, so here we come to sampling. Now this is really important for your cycles rendering, because it's going to be responsible for kind of the quality that you're working at. And there's two things that you can kind of work with. The first is seems to be this clamp indirect. If you're getting a lot of speckles in your render, see if I can kind of get some here. A lot of little white speckles. It seems like the clamp indirect seems to be to get rid of a lot of the noise, and it seems like you don't need much, like anywhere from 0 to 1. But at 1, all of a sudden, a lot of times the speckles come back together, and I'm actually not getting them right now. I was kind of expecting to, and a little disappointed. I was expecting some more sample rate noise coming in here. But if I go to 0.6, 0.5, that seems to really do the trick. I mean, if I zoom in here a little bit more, actually seeing a little bit of noise in that area right there, and you can see it if I just go to 0. If I just go to 0. There is a touch more noise in that shadow area. Sometimes it's really, really, really obvious, and sometimes not so much. But yeah, this noise reduction is really nice. And you just kind of go through values, 0.04, 0.05, 0.06 seems to take care of that noise most of the time in what I've been kind of experimenting with lately. The samples here too, your rendering samples, and you can kind of hover over these things. The number of samples to render for each pixel. So every pixel it's going to do right now 128 samples. You can bump that up to 56, 512, and it's going to make a higher quality for each pixel. Just realize that, again, all these sorts of things increase your render time greatly. So as I start to play with these, one of the things I haven't been doing but I should be doing is going back up to the top and hitting a render button, and then allowing it to kind of render out and taking a look at the quality of what I've got. Sometimes I'll even save them, and then I'll view them on my monitors side by side, and so I can see the difference between, say, 128 and 256 samples, or 0.04 clamp indirect and 0.06. Having that kind of the ability to kind of compare the images side by side before you render out the whole movie can actually be really, really handy, just to kind of get a sense of the quality and what your GPU is able to be doing and all that other stuff. So you can see it's moving pretty quickly here at 1080p. Obviously, you see I'm looking at I'm going to be well over a minute for the entire frame here. And so, of course, to do my whole movie, you're talking at about 150 to 160 minutes to do a very short 3-second animation. The GPU that I have is a NVIDIA GTX 970. It's not, as fast or have as many CUDA cores as the newest 1070s, 1080 Ti's. The best thing to do is multiple graphics cards in SLI if you got the cash for that. But that just kind of helps, to kind of see how much time it's going to take. I mean, if I go to CPU now and then I were to go again and render a frame with 12 threads, it's moving pretty fast here. Just out of curiosity. Actually, see, with the top level here, it's actually going to take a little bit longer, I'm thinking. Oh, and it crashes. No, it didn't crash. I thought it crashed there for a second. But with the CPU, it definitely is taking a lot longer to render out this frame. And I'm going to be looking at 1.5 minutes, maybe even 2 minutes for a frame. So, as I'm starting to get higher up in the resolution, it's interesting how the how it looks like the CPU is actually kind of slowing down a little bit. I don't know. So let's see here. So 49. Oh, okay. So that wasn't bad. That was 50 seconds, 50.61 seconds. So it's actually still a little faster than my GPU, which in some ways is a little disheartening and disappointing. I love my GPU. I love that 970. It was great for the price. But yeah, maybe it's getting to be time to replace it with a nice 1070 or a couple 1070s. So anyway, you've got a whole bunch of different things that you can just play with here. That it can be a lot of fun to kind of play with too. Let's see. There was one other thing. Volume sampling. I'm trying to find it. Baking things is important. You should, that's one thing. It might be a different demo. Okay. So here. Now, one of the things that I've read that you can kind of experiment with is the tiling sizes. The tiles are those little squares that you see that kind of show up as it starts to render. You can make those bigger or smaller. And I've heard for GPUs, making them a little bit bigger can actually help the speed of the GPU. So instead of 64, let's go 256 pixels, and let's just see what happens. And a lot of times, this experimentation process can really help you. So just go up there, and I'm going to click, I'm going to go back to my GPU, and I'm going to click render. And let's just see if this frame is any faster. So if you remember before, same exact frame with the 64 pixel cubes was running at about a minute. And so let's see what we're at here. So yeah, this is actually looks like it's gonna, by its prediction, it's actually gonna speed it up. 256 by 256 gridded squares, and we're gonna run. Let's see, boom, 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 and our total is 30 seconds, 30.26 seconds. So just by increasing the square, I actually decrease my time by half. So that's actually a really big increase or decrease in time just by increasing the number of squares by a little bit. Now let's do something, and if this crashes, I apologize. We're going to see what happens. I'm going to keep myself at 256, and I'm going to change it to the CPU, and let's just see what happens when I render out a single frame at 256 by 256 with the CPU. I can already hear my fans kind of starting to gear up here, and hopefully this won't crash. We'll see what happens. Looks like, yeah, it looks like we're moving along pretty well here. A little hiccup here. Kind of weird how it kind of like pauses for a second or two in the middle there. It's interesting that it's kind of hanging up on some of these empty areas. I don't know exactly what's going on. Alright, but essentially there we go. So, interestingly enough, setting up the squares to 256 by 256 has put my render time per frame at 55 seconds. So 55 seconds for the CPU, but the GPU is now doing each frame at 30 seconds. So that's a really huge and really big deal to speed up your rendering with cycles, is to take your GPU and bump that frame size up. I'm actually really impressed with that. Obviously, going to stick with the GPU, and you could try. Let's go 512. So if I go to 512 pixels, let's just see what happens. I'm not sure that this is going to actually make that much of a difference. It may actually slow it down. But hey, let's see. I'm going to save really quickly in case it crashes again. And let's just see what happens. So, ooh, boom. Yeah, so huge 512 pixels rectangles. Really interesting to see what's happening here. See what we're at. We're 15 seconds, 17. This is going to be interesting to see if we're under 30. I don't think we're going to get under 30. I think we're going to be a little bit too high here. Wow, well, it did actually. It did actually decrease our time by 2 seconds, a little less than 2 seconds. So that's an interesting little experiment there, and you could probably try to even put it up at 1024. I don't know. I'm not going to do that right now. I think I'm starting to push the limits here, and I'm afraid that I might crash it. My graphics card is not overclocked, by the way. It's set to stock. I do have MSI Afterburner running with a custom fan curve, but other than that, it's all stock. I haven't played with it enough to kind of start doing any overclocking on the graphics card, so I can't tell you how that would yield any differences or anything like that. But it's still a pretty hefty, nice little card. So I'm pretty impressed with that. 30 seconds per frame. That's going to put me at for 100. That's going to put me at like 60 minute or wait. Yeah, 60 minutes or so to render out all the whole movie, whereas at set to 64 on those squares, it would have taken me like 2-3 hours. So that's a really big difference taking the tiles. I haven't played with tile order. Hilbert spiral is the default. I always keep it there. I don't know if this would change the speed at all. It might, but yeah, I've never really played with that. So anyway, that's basically it. So essentially what would happen is once I played with it, I get my final settings, and then I get ready to go. Then I hit the animation button, and the animation button then renders from 0 to whatever you've set it to, or actually frame 1 to 150. It's going to do all those frames that are in the light gray area here on the timeline, and it's going to save it out as I have specified, which is an MPEG-4 at H.264. And if there was audio, it would save that out as an MP3 right now. Actually, I would probably choose FLAC or AAC, to be completely honest with you, and set it to 320 kilobits per second minimum. And but a lot of times you're putting in audio separately, so that's not really important. And then the clamp indirect is really important. So in review, let me just do this. In review, a couple of quick things. One, if you've got a really decent GPU, set it to a GPU, okay? I like to set it to new window so that it pops open a new window. Make sure your resolutions are the same. Make sure your frame range is the same. Make sure your frame rate is what you are expecting it to be, okay? Set your formats, H.264, MPEG-4, or whatever you want to do, still images, PNGs, TIFFs, whatever. Make sure you double check your bit rates, okay? Come down here, check your clamp indirect, do a couple test renders, see if 0.02 or 0.04 or 0.06 works, okay? And then up your samples if you can, 256 or higher, test that. And then lastly, go down here under the performance and set your tile size, and it's going to mean a major difference in the speed of how your renders work. So hopefully that helps you out. I know I said that's just the basics, and guess what? It really is. There's way more stuff that you can do in rendering to make things faster, higher quality, whatever. This is basically just a start, but honestly, this will do it for most people. This would get you a good animation that'd be ready for YouTube or Vimeo or something like that, and would probably look just stunning as long as your textures are all set up correctly. So I hope this helps everybody. I know this is a little bit of a longer demo, but I hope this helps you. And if you've got any questions, leave them in the comments below. Give it a thumbs up or a thumbs down if you thought it was horrible. And if you thought it was horrible, please leave me a comment. Tell me what I forgot. Tell me if I left anything out that you thought was really important. And yeah, have a great evening.